All right. As I said, I'll send this out to the rest of the team. Hopefully, have a few more joining once we get started here. But thank you all for joining. A lot of this that we're going to go over today is going to get eventually kind of re-reviewed by CDE steering. So Dr. Gurney, you'll get to look at this again at some point. We just have a couple of items that need a little bit of conversation, discussion on how exactly we want them, would prefer they be collected. Um, Last meeting, we discussed what elements we for sure wanted to collect, and now we just have a couple of items that have a little bit more nuance as to how we're going to collect them. So let me share this presentation and jump into this. This over here. Okay. So first I'll be going over kind of the results that we went over last time, and then there was a little bit of discussion last time and a few changes since then. So I did want to at least provide an updated list of the CDEs as they stand today. We did break them up into these different topic areas. So first being patient, a couple of changes since our last meeting. During our last meeting, we decided to remove patient occupation industry and just keep patient occupation. So originally those were kind of separated out, but after looking at all the different options and definitions, the group decided to just stick with the patient's occupation itself. And then the only other change was after further follow up with the Fitbird team. Date of birth is an element that exists within the system. However, there's been new protocol that doesn't allow for that submission of that data. So we've gone ahead and removed that for the moment as well. So that is what we've seen in terms of patient here. Everything else has reached consensus for inclusion. So we got some age elements. We will talk in a little bit about these location elements, state, city, zip, and then some more kind of more demographic, employment, education, things like that. When it comes to facility-specific elements, those that were, all of these met inclusion, alcohol screen, drug screen, as well as results, as well as this, whether this uh, was a transfer patient. And then finally, injury elements. Included most of these, just a few with the strikeouts, maybe five or so. A lot of elements related to specific injuries, including ICD-10 codes, as well as a little bit more broad elements, things like trauma type or a manner of death. We'll talk a little bit about trauma type, which is kind of a very kind of broad category, not so specific as kind of the ICD coding. So these are the lists as they stand now. All of these elements will be collected in one way or another. As I said, now it's a matter of talking about just a couple of specifics about how we want to collect them. So first things first, there's a few elements that were selected by multiple work groups. So they were selected by this work group as well as at least one other work group. So we'll be going through these. I'll be getting feedback from this group. And the idea is that we'll provide this feedback as well as feedback from the other groups to CDE steering committee to make a final determination on how we would like these elements to be collected. So here's a list of these elements. So trauma type or mechanism, as I said, blunt penetrating, we'll go through that one. Pre-existing conditions, education level, and then incident state and incident city. So I know that there's these overlap with a couple different groups. I know, for example, the incident state and city was the pre-hospital group was interested in that information. So a couple things to kind of go through here. So first element and kind of what we need to discuss is for trauma type of the current existing element within FITBR only has the permissible values, the potential options of blunt and penetrating. And there were some comments left. The comments in the Delphi recommended adding burn as well as an other. So this element as it exists currently is what's called a unique data element, which means that it hasn't been formally adopted by FitBur yet. So get interested in getting some feedback on exactly what options, what permissible values does the group think are valuable for this particular data element.
I think it's important to have burn.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that. You took the words out of my mouth. You know, I think that we have to include burn. I don't know if that was my comment or someone else's, but uh you know, I hope we can agree that adding burn as a common data element is important over.
Okay. And I believe that I didn't add that. I should have added that here. The other group had mentioned adding burn as well. So I do see burn getting added. We do also have members of ABA working in these groups. So that totally checks out, and I see there being a consensus across the work groups on adding burn. Thoughts on another element or another potential value that got brought up was the idea of adding blast as a unique permissible value.
Yeah, I'm sure that was either Holcomb or Stallings that brought that up, you know, for a common data element for military research, you know, blast or explosion, you know, is important. You know, I mean, I think I think I'd have to kind of get some more consensus on that. One of the things that we have a hard time, and we're when we try and compare any military data using NTDB or TQIP, there's nothing that really matches. But I think that that's because it's a military unique injury. But, you know, it's one of the things that's come up. Can we use explosion and compare cohorts with blast? But, you know, how would we define them, and if they would be different or similar enough to do, you know, cohort comparison. But, I think that, you know, kind of predicting the future, should we, you know, that having explosion might not be a bad common data element to add as a mechanism over.
Certainly you see it in terrorist attacks.
Yes, yeah.
So I think I fully agree that burn should be an option. I think the challenge with specifically this data element is that these are not mutually exclusive categories. So someone may have penetrating and blunt injuries, or with burn, it's not unusual to have blunt injuries and burn at the same time. So it either needs to be separate indicators where you can say yes to multiple things, or there needs to be an option for multiple. I think having it as separate indicators is more useful. Realistically, like I've certainly done a rough cut where we lump people into blunt or penetrating, and we just use the ICD codes to do that. And it's, like, roughly speaking, a helpful way of sorting people. But it does have that limitation of, well, what if they have, if somebody were completing this, like, entering data, and you have a patient that has both, then how do you answer the question?
You know, the way that, so I mean, I think that it would also, that would very much depend on somebody designing their study. You know, would they include primary, you know, primary mechanism of injury and secondary mechanisms of injury? I know for our registry, for the Department of Defense Trauma Registry, and it's hard for our abstractors actually, because we make them, and sometimes has to be adjudicated, kind of say what the primary because, you know, rarely is an explosion, you know, it's, you know, almost always combined, you know, with some element of burn, you know, blunt and penetrating. So, yes, ma'am, I think that's, that would also depend a lot on the CRF. Is there something in there as a I mean, I guess it wouldn't be a common data element, but, you know, that kind of, you know, that, you know, primary mechanism or sorry, not mechanism, primary injury type. I don't know if you guys have found that when you've done any studies that, you know, having primary injury type and then secondary injury type over.
I will say that this concern and issue is something that we're currently dealing with on the Mimic project, which is, Dr. Eastridge having to go through and multi-select versus single select, and then identifying by going through, all the medical records to determine what is the primary versus the secondary. That's literally a distinction we're having to do now on the back end of that specific project. So I understand the concerns. I don't believe, I mean, we could potentially create a primary, the distinction within the CDE itself as there being, we want to specify, right, that this is the primary, or, create another that is the secondary. As Dr. Jarman said, we could also make it a multi-select. We can definitely do that where we don't want to only allow one option to be selected, but then we get into is there a primary versus is there a secondary? So we have a couple of different ways. I don't know if there's a specific way that you all would prefer. There's a couple of different ways to go about collecting it. It's just Dr. Ryan.
Yeah, I have a question. So are they getting this information from the chart? Or are they getting this information secondarily from some code or some ICD-9 code? Because I don't know, is there a code for combined injuries?
So how the data will be collected will be up to kind of the PI for their particular project. This comes down to once data is being submitted within the system, how would we like that standardized way for that data to be submitted to the system? So that way all of these projects are submitting the data in somewhat of a consistent way so that we can do better aggregation on the back end.
Want penetrating burn blast? Combined?
Ma'am, that's how we organize them in the military trauma registry, blunt penetrating burn and blast, and then if there's primary and secondary injury types. But I think that having a common data element that indicates that it's a combined injury is, I think that's a good idea.
Like it kind of like it depends on how, if this is used in a secondary analysis, how someone's using it. Like if you're just teasing out penetrating versus blunt because clinically they're very different and need different systems of care, versus using this as a rough approximation of severity, and that somebody who has multiple injury types versus somebody who has one injury type, it's hard to say exactly how this should be formatted without knowing how it's being used, other than to say the broadest possible formatting is the most generally useful, and people can take a broad format and tailor it down to their needs when they're doing the analysis.
And I will say that I believe Acute has, or one of our other work groups has then selected within their group of a whole data element on blunt and an entire data element on penetrating, which then has many, many permissible values for each one of those. So if that context helps at all.
Yes, it does, because, like burn, it could be radiation, it could be scald, it could be flame, contact, all different.
Mm-hmm. So for the moment, our recommendation, blunt penetrating burn blast. Keeping the other, add an other would that provide value?
So and this is where it gets messy. I think we have to have an other, because there are weird things that can make it into the data set that aren't penetrating blunt, burn, or blast, and because it's better to have a catch-all for other than to leave people in a position where they skip the question and we don't know if it was truly unknown or just doesn't fit.
Gotcha. And once again, there's another group looking at this specific element as well. So the idea is we're getting great feedback from you guys on your recommendations, and then work feedback from the other work group, and then see what the steering committee wants to do based off of your recommendations. Olga, you like to jump in?
Yes, I've put into the chat link to ICD-10 recommended injury codes for injury. So maybe it makes sense to look at it just for the sake of standardization.
So I think, don't we have a separate data element for the more granular mechanism?
We have two different ICDs related to much more specifics.
Yeah.
I would say this place of occurrence external cause code is maybe what you're referring to for kind of a mechanism.
So I thought so that's like that is different than what I thought we had. Just there's the ICD injury diagnosis, this place of occurrence code, and then the separate external cause of injury codes, which is what the categories Olga just shared are
Okay.
based on.
Okay.
If we aren't capturing just the external cause of injury codes, we should be.
Now that you're mentioning it, I want to say it's part of the core, but let me pull it up really
I would
quick.
expect it to be. That's a
There's quite a bit going that happen. Yes, and yes, the E codes is part of the core elements that have been adopted.
Drowning. Oh, that's not really described.
So that would fall within the other.
Yeah.
and that's one of those, like, is that really trauma? And it depends on who you talk to and what type of hospital they're at.
Yeah, choking.
So I'll jot down those recommendations and then we can kind of send them up the ladder and see what comes back down. But I think we have a good handle on an understanding of this topic and kind of the options that we have. Next element, a little bit different. So pre-existing conditions, the definition that was selected for inclusion for this element came from NTDS. The way that element gets collected in NTDS is many separate elements as yes or no questions. So we do not want to create 30 CDEs with yes or no questions for each one of these pre-existing conditions. The idea is that we create one CDE and then all of the pre-existing conditions are kind of a drop down for the permissible values for that particular element. So with this element, when we group them into a single element, we need to identify what that definition for that element would be, because when we look at NTDS, each specific pre-existing condition has their own unique definition. So to give you kind of an example of something in the realm, this was the other option for this particular element on the Delphi, was the FITBR definition for medical history condition text, which essentially states the condition or disease reported by the participant or subject or documented in the medical record as part of medical history. So, do we want to kind of use that boilerplate, but just change it up for pre-existing conditions reported by the participant? And this is kind of what the element, how the element was adopted from the Delphi, this is what it looks like. NTDS, it was originally many, many different elements. These are those individual elements. The idea being we're going to convert this into one element. And these will be all the possible ways to answer that question with the multi-select option.
That sounds reasonable.
Any specific thoughts on the definition that we would like for, this element as it is created within the system? As I said, this is kind of the ballpark closest thing I could find to somewhat of how we would want to describe it.
Well, do you need to say as part of the medical history or documented medical record?
We can say whatever we want.
because, it could not, it could be the congestive heart failure could be, I don't know, part of well, you don't want to record something that happened in the ICU.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think you can, like, I like this as a kind of general definition. I would maybe instead of record documented in the medical record as part of the medical history, it would be documented as existing prior to the trauma admission. Like that leaves it as being a little bit open.
Okay. Once again, this is an element that another group is looking at. So the idea is just we're giving some, specific feedback to steering on how we think this, the definition for this element, what it should be.
But I understand that like it is possible that someone would have a pre-existing condition that isn't documented in the history, but is
Mhm.
kind of first recognized when they come in for their traumatic injury. But it isn't because of the trauma, it isn't part of that, but yeah. So like leaving it open to things that were potentially first recorded on that trauma admission, even though they aren't part of the traumatic injury.
Yeah, makes sense.
So does this include like things like status post-stroke? Like if that's a pre-existing condition?
It currently includes this list here on the right-hand side, which is just pulled straight from the NTDS list of possible pre-existing conditions.
So there isn't another past medical history of, is that another?
I don't believe we have another element specifically looking at the medical history. There is a medical history, form structure that exists within the system already within the FITBR system. That by all means someone within the NTRR could use. We haven't delved that deep into the form structures quite yet. Still focusing on the elements themselves. Any other thoughts before we move on to the next?
Nope.
So those were quote unquote the straightforward ones. And now we have some that need a little bit more nuance. So I'm gonna give you guys a little bit more background on kind of what our options are and why we're having to talk about these specific elements again. So first of all, providing context to some of these elements. So BRICS, the Biomedical Research Informatics Computing System, is the system that houses the NTRR as well as FITBR. So that is the system that houses these repositories. And the idea of the system is to use a limited number of CDEs, the smallest as possible, to achieve consistency and avoid what inevitably becomes thousands and thousands and thousands of elements that no longer really become common anymore because there are so many. So that also makes things like searching, querying, aggregating on the back end a lot easier if we can be very specific with in terms of which CDEs get created. So the idea is that all the CDEs that we are recommending out of our group belong in one of these categories that I'm showing here. It's either what's called a main concept, an indicator, or a modifier descriptor. And all the ones we've looked at, except for these last couple that we're going to look at, are one of these. But we have a couple that don't actually fall into one of these buckets. So we need to tweak them a little bit so that they fall into one of these buckets. The main concept is kind of how it sounds. It's the principal endpoint or main concept, primary outcome of something. An indicator, most of ours are main concepts. An indicator is a CDE that is essentially a yes or no as to whether something was done. So an example of what we have is whether a drug test was performed. Yes, no. Oh, okay. Now what were the results of the drug test? That would be a separate element. And then finally we have modifiers, and then modifiers help describe main concepts most of the time. So I'll show you an example. I know this is kind of all new information for everybody. To show you an example of why we need to put them into these kind of buckets of different types of CDEs. So that's one way. We have to focus on trying to follow and get them into these buckets. There are also something that I just now mentioned, which are form structures or groups. So grouping of elements. You guys are used to creating your CRFs for your projects. Think of these as kind of similar, where we're going to have very long forms, and within those forms, there's different groupings for specific elements that kind of work, make sense to be asked together. So we can also add some type of context to CDEs by grouping them in particular ways. So as an example of why we need to look at this, education level. So this group looked at education level. There was some feedback about making sure that the education level was before the injury. And you can see how if we want that specificity in the CDE, we could potentially be creating many, many CDEs. We could have a before injury education level, an after injury education level, at time of assessment education level. And now imagine what that would happen for all the CDEs if they all are using these different timeframes. We end up having tens of thousands of CDEs because we're trying to make them for each specific time frame. We don't want to do that. So I'm going to show you that there's a couple of different ways that we can incorporate this time element into education level. And please, Olga, jump in if at any point, because you're the expert on all this stuff. So ways of providing context. The first way is by using some type of modifier. So on the right-hand side is a CDE that exists that would be paired with, for example, education level. One element would be education level, the other element would be context type, and then as you see on the right-hand side, we have after the context of the education level. After injury, before injury, at time of assessment, last year, death, prior to death, and so on. So the idea is instead of creating, 5 different education level elements all at different times, is we create one education level, and then we pair it with context type. So we'll get to education in a second. So that's one way, is using some type of modifier, and think of modifier as something that can be paired. And we have some that are related to the time. We have some that are related to location. So the location element has to do with, is this at ED arrival? Is this at ED discharge? Is this in the ICU? Is this a pre-hospital? So you can add that location context to, let's say, systolic blood pressure. Is this systolic blood pressure right when they got there, when they're getting discharged, whatever. So we can use modifiers, or we can also use what are called form structures or groupings on something like a CRF, except these exist in the repository. So for example, location-related information, if we were going to look at something like the subjects, there is a grouping that already got created that's called subject, country of birth, and current residency. And what that does is that captures those things all grouped together in one place. So that way we don't have to have, country of residence, birth country, the country you're currently living in, the country where the injury took place. We just create one, and it's just within that specific grouping, that context of, we know this is for example, where the patient lives now, and it would just list the country. So I'll show you an example of that here in a second. We're going to have to deal with that particular issue of location, cities and states and zip codes. So this is kind of what a form structure looks like. This is a group within the demographics form. So within the demographics form structure are many, many different groupings. This is just one small grouping where we have things that make sense that go together. And we're going to ask these questions together. As you can see on the right-hand side, nothing is typically required. So we understand that every researcher is going to be collecting, what's important to them. The idea is that when it gets put into the system, it gets put in a similar way, not necessarily that they put in something for every single CVE. So there's still that flexibility, but then anybody that collects it, it's going to be collected in the same way. So that takes us kind of to education level. The top definition here is what was selected by this group, which was very specific, which is highest level of education pre-injury. And we understand that that context is very important, that we understand that this is before the injury, what their education level was. Here are the permissible values for that. And then on the right-hand side, we have what the comments were, which is clearly like everyone is, wants to make sure that we have that distinction of this being pre-injury. So this top is what Epi selected. And below here, outcomes in rehab selected a different element with different permissible values. But you'll notice that this element doesn't have any time, before injury, after injury specifics. So kind of the recommendation is that something like this is adopted, and then we use that context type CDE I showed a couple slides back, and we pair it. Olga, what's up?
Yes, my comment is regarding education level USA type. I believe it is an NIDS core data element recommended for traumatic brain injury. So, and it is specifically, it doesn't specify if it was pre-injury or after injury at the time of the injury, because this kind of information is left for either modifiers or the contact should be provided by other means. Does it make sense what I'm saying?
Yes, thank you, Olga, for jumping in. So it's a NINS core, so it's very highly recommended by NINS. Okay. Any thoughts, other questions on this? The idea being that we try and get away from the specific of pre-injury. But I did want to get any other potential feedback on there's quite a big difference in permissible values as well.
Nick, sorry, I'm being quiet. Like I don't really have any feedback on this. I was surprised that it was even that all the education stuff was a common data element. I haven't, maybe it's just the studies that I read, but I haven't really seen it used very much. So I don't have any thoughts on this one. I know our group is small today, but anybody else, any thoughts for Nick on this?
So I cannot remember what I actually rated in the voting rounds, but looking at these now and especially the comments, I think the education level USA type options are better because they are clearer as to what they mean. So like, as the comment pointed out, what does none/basic primary equal to 0 to 4 years mean? Does that mean 0 to 4 years old or 0 to 4 years worth of education? Versus the specific grade levels are pretty clear.
Awesome. Thank you for that feedback. I will mark down that we are okay with education level USA type, and that's been selected already by another group, so that will make things easy across the board, and it fits with it being a more main concept of just education level. So that's good as well. So thank you for that feedback. The last one, I would say this is the kind of the most complex one, leaves a lot, the complex one for the end. We had patient as well as incident locations selected from this group. So that includes patient, state, city, zip, patient home, that is, state, city, zip, as well as incident, state, city, zip. So you can see that's already 6 CDEs, and we could potentially have, death, state, city, zip, and so on. So the idea is that we want to collect the main concept. The main concepts being state, cities, and zips. And then we can add the context in some other fashion. So I'm going to kind of present 2 kind of options, and please, Olga, jump in as well. This is a little bit more of the complex ones. I wanted to kind of, simplify it as much as I could. And that is, we stick with the options of creating 3 distinct CDEs, patient home state, patient home city, patient home zip. Or the other option is to create a form group within the demographics form. And we name it something like patient, subject, home location. And that's what it'll say at kind of the top of the form group. And then underneath of that group, there will be the main concepts. And then it will be that the context will be added for it from the naming of the group. But when it comes to the CDEs that are actually created, there will just be the main concepts. And then the idea is we do something similar for location, incident locations, right? First option is we just create 3 CDEs, 1 for each, or we put something similar, but in the injury history. There's an injury history form structure. Once again, that form structure is going to have many different groups. We could potentially add this information to an existing group or create a completely new group that's just, incident location and add that information in there. I think for today, it's, educating everyone on kind of what our options are. And then I can work with Olga on exactly, how it gets implemented and what would make most sense within those groupings. If we could add it to an existing grouping, create a new grouping. But you can see how if we keep going about creating CDEs this way, we could have many, many different states, cities, and zips. Thoughts, questions? Olga, please, if I butchered anything or you can add any more context.
Oh, I think it's good. It's very good presented.
Because we do want to make sure that this data can get collected in the system. The idea being that it's easily aggregatable and analyzable on the back end.
Does it matter if it's 3 distinct CDEs or if it's just this big one? I mean, what happens if they only have a portion of the information? Does that make it then an incomplete data point?
It does not. So each one of these, so if we were going to look at, for example, creating 3 distinct, these would all be their own element, and you could fill out whichever one you have information for. If these were going to be grouped into a grouping within a form, it's the same thing. Nothing would ever be required. They would just be grouped together, and that way, if you had all of the information, you could put it together all in that same spot. But they would be distinct data elements within that form. So you could fill out whatever you had.
So if they only had the state, but not the city and the zip, that element would still be completed?
Correct. You could look at that group within the form, and if all you had was state, you could just fill out what state you were in, and then that would be that. Once again, nothing would be required. Nothing would limit the submission of, whatever data you happen to have. Again, it's up to the kind of PIs or, what their study's looking at and what information is important to them. But nothing would be required. It's okay if there's no other thoughts. This will get, reviewed by another work group, and then eventually, CDE steering will also have to look at this as well and kind of see what the work groups, have come up with. So just kind of going over what our current options are.
My vote is they're both acceptable.
I agree. I was just gonna say that, I think if you're going to, I think they're both acceptable, and I know it can get complex when, you look at all the different locations, but yeah, I think that I think it's acceptable, and to do location, where it happens, the home address, the incident site, and then the death site. I mean, if location is going to be considered at all, I kind of feel like you have to go all in with it, and not just collect one of them, even though it does potentially add 6 more CDEs over.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much for all your feedback. That was great kind of discussion today. We've gone through all the things that we need to for the moment. What I'll be doing here next is kind of organizing everything that we talked about today. I will be sending this out to the rest of the group to see, if they have any other feedback. Last time I did that, I got quite a bit of feedback from those who were unable to participate. So that was great, so that we could kind of get some of the elements over the finish line that didn't reach consensus. We were able to do that through email, so that was great. So I'll be organizing the kind of recommendations from today, as well as all the other, CDEs we've looked at already. These elements that we looked at today happens to overlap with other work groups. So those work groups are meeting here in the next month or so as well to go through a similar process that we just went through. The idea being that we're going to provide some recommendations to CDE steering, and then they will kind of look at what our and the other work group recommendations are, and come to a final say on how these elements get collected. That being said, after that, or simultaneously, I'll begin kind of writing the white paper, which is going to have, go through the entire process that we've gone through between, looking at the papers and pulling the elements for the Delphi, completing the Delphi, these discussions and results. And eventually that will be submitted to the executive committee for review and approval as well. So our next meeting is scheduled for the first Tuesday in October. Dr. Gurney, would you like me to keep this same time or send out another doodle?
Well, I don't know if we have a low attendance today because a lot of people are traveling, or if this, what do you guys think? I mean, I'll defer to the rest of the guys on the net. Should we keep this same time, or should we try and I know those doodles are a little bit painful and probably really painful, but really I know people will review the meetings and videos, but it's better to have more people on the net. So what's the thought of you guys? Is this a good, I mean, obviously it's a good time for the people who showed up, but it might not be a good time for the people who didn't.
This time is generally fine for me.
Okay.
It's questionable for me.
Nick, can we just send out another doodle? I know
Sure.
that's cool, and you usually have to like text me 3 times to remind me to find my emails, because they usually go to my junk. But I think yeah, I think you should send out another one, just because schedules are so fluid.
Sure. Yeah, I'll send out another one, see what works for everybody. And I mean, ideally the next is, a final review of here's our final results and what we're recommending. And
Right. That'd be
that's
good. It'd be good to get many of us on the call as possible.
Yeah. So that's the kind of goal is I'm able to facilitate, the white paper prior, and then we can then jump on a call review, see if anyone has any thoughts or last minute changes you'd like before we send it up the ladder.
Okay.
So we're getting down here to the finish line with this group. So I really appreciate it.
Amazing. Thank you for all your organization, Nick, too.
Absolutely. Any other questions? All right. Well, I really appreciate everybody jumping on today. I will get this video out as well as the PowerPoint either later today or tomorrow, and as well as a doodle poll. So please fill that out. Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.